Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something we all grapple with constantly: focus. We're diving into how our brains handle the flood of information vying for our attention, specifically looking at the fascinating concepts of interference and inhibition.
Hmm.
The research you shared with us is a real treasure trove, exploring everything from the history of these ideas in psychology to how they impact learning, memory, development, and even certain psychological conditions.
Yeah, quite a range.
Our mission today is to extract the crucial insights from this material and, understand what they mean for how you learn and think.
That's right. The sources you've provided offer a really rich historical perspective on how psychologists have conceptualized these challenges. That leads us to the evolution of thinking on interference and inhibition.
Right.
We'll then explore the contemporary understanding of these processes and see how they manifest in diverse aspects of human cognition and behavior. It's quite a journey through over a century of scientific inquiry.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the history. What struck me was how interference was initially understood. It wasn't some, abstract idea, but a very real performance dip when irrelevant information or actions get in the way. Think about this for yourself. Have you ever struggled to learn something new because something old keeps popping into your head and, muddying the waters? That's the essence of interference.
Precisely. It's that feeling of your brain being a bit cluttered, making it harder to access or process the information you need.
Yeah.
And then there's inhibition, which is the brain's active way of trying to declutter.
Ah, okay.
It's the process of suppressing those irrelevant thoughts or actions. So going back to your example, inhibition would be your brain actively working to push aside that old information
Yeah.
to make space for the new.
Right.
Sherrington's key insight way back in the early 20th century was that inhibition isn't just a passive stopping force, but an active and essential mechanism for coordinating all our actions, both big and small, a foundational idea for understanding how our nervous system works.
What's fascinating is how central inhibition was seen early on. The research talks about this belief and its crucial role in integrating all our behaviors. It sounds like the early neurophysiologists were really onto something.
They absolutely were.
Looking at things like vagal inhibition, how the vagus nerve slows down heart rate as a kind of model for broader central nervous system inhibition.
Yes, they saw inhibition as a fundamental principle of neural organization, essential for creating smooth, coordinated actions, rather than just a jumble of reflexes. Sherrington's synthesis of this work was groundbreaking, providing a framework for understanding how the nervous system refines our responses.
But then the research highlights this interesting shift with the rise of behaviorism. It seems like focusing solely on observable behaviors led to a bit of a sidelining of these internal dampening processes. Why do you think that happened?
Well, behaviorism, with its emphasis on what could be directly observed and measured, naturally gravitated towards studying stimuli and the resulting responses. Inhibition, being an internal process of suppression, was much harder to quantify and observe directly.
Made sense for them, I guess.
Yeah. The focus shifted to the facilitative effects, what directly led to a behavior, and inhibition, while still acknowledged, didn't fit neatly into that paradigm.
But as you said earlier, the story doesn't end there. Here's where it gets really interesting for me. The 1960s brought a resurgence fueled by major breakthroughs in understanding the brain itself. The discovery of GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, seems like a pivotal moment.
Absolutely. Finding GABA provided the concrete biological evidence that inhibition wasn't just a theoretical concept, but a real physiological process happening in your brain.
Right, physical stuff.
It demonstrated that there are specific chemical messengers whose primary role is to dampen neural activity. This, along with the mapping of inhibitory connections within the central nervous system and the identification of other inhibitory neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, really solidified the importance of inhibition in how our brains function.
Wow.
Think of it like a sculptor carefully removing bits of clay to reveal the final form. Inhibition refines our neural activity in a similar way.
And it sounds like these biological findings started to connect with what researchers were observing in behavior. Studies using EEG and ERP, which measure brain activity, they showed that children and older adults often exhibited weaker inhibition compared to young adults.
Yeah, that's a key connection.
And this seemed to line up with cognitive and behavioral difficulties that were thought to stem from this weaker inhibition.
What's fascinating here is how these different levels of analysis, from the microscopic world of neurotransmitters to the large-scale patterns of brain activity, and then to observable behavior, all started to converge.
Putting the pieces together.
Exactly. It painted a much more comprehensive picture of how inhibition plays a vital role throughout our lives, influencing our ability to focus, learn, and control our actions at different developmental stages.
Now, the research then takes us to a specific area of the brain that seems particularly important for all this, the frontal cortex. For someone who isn't a neuroanatomist, where exactly is that located, and why is it such a key player in our ability to manage distractions?
Right, so the frontal cortex is located at the very front of your brain, right behind your forehead. Think of it as the brain's executive control center.
The boss.
Kind of, yeah.
Mm.
Responsible for planning, decision-making, and crucially managing distractions. It can be divided into several regions. We have the primary motor cortex, which handles voluntary movements,
Yeah?
the premotor cortex, involved in planning sequences of movements, and then the prefrontal cortex, which is our main focus here. The prefrontal cortex itself has subregions like the orbital frontal, which is more tied to emotions and social behavior, and the dorsolateral, which is key for working memory and problem solving, both relying heavily on the ability to inhibit irrelevant information.
And it sounds like this prefrontal cortex is incredibly well connected to the rest of the brain.
Absolutely. It has intricate networks of connections, forming feedback loops with almost every other part of the cortex, the sensory areas that process what we see and hear, the association areas that integrate information, and even the limbic system, which
Emotions.
right, plays a significant role in our emotions. It also has important connections to subcortical structures like the thalamus, which acts as a relay station for sensory info. This rich interconnectedness positions the prefrontal cortex as a central hub for integrating information and orchestrating complex cognitive functions.
What I also found really striking is the developmental timeline of the frontal cortex. It's the last part of the brain to fully mature, with this process called myelination, the insulation of nerve fibers that speeds up transmission, not even complete until our early to mid-teens.
Yeah, that's quite late in development.
But then it's also one of the first areas to show signs of aging later in life, with potential declines in size, thickness, and neural connections.
This prolonged development and earlier aging are highly suggestive of the frontal cortex's role in those higher-order cognitive abilities that emerge later in life, like complex planning and reasoning.
The really complex stuff.
Exactly. And they're also more susceptible to age-related decline. Myelination is crucial for efficient and rapid communication between neurons. The fact that the frontal lobes are the last to be fully myelinated underscores the importance of this extended maturation for the development of sophisticated cognitive control, including the ability to effectively manage interference.
The research then delves into what happens when there's damage or lesions to the frontal cortex. Early studies with animals showed impairments in basic sensory motor tasks and problem solving. But the discovery by Jacobson with the delayed reaction task seems particularly relevant to our discussion on inhibition, right?
Yes, Jacobson's work was a pivotal moment. He observed that monkeys with lesions to their frontal lobes struggled with a task where they had to remember the location of a hidden reward after a brief delay.
Okay.
What was most telling was that even when they saw the reward being moved to a new location, after the delay, they would often still reach for the old, now empty spot.
Huh. Even though they saw it move.
Yep. This strongly suggested that the frontal cortex plays a crucial role in inhibiting previously learned responses that are no longer relevant.
And it seems like similar patterns emerged when researchers studied humans with frontal lobe damage resulting from injury or illness. They also showed difficulties in controlling interference from both the outside world and their own internal thoughts.
Precisely. While human studies are more complex due to the variability of lesions and individual differences, the findings generally corroborated the animal research. A key observation is the impaired ability to suppress irrelevant information and actions.
Like getting stuck.
Exactly. The examples in the research, like the perseverative errors on the Wisconsin card sorting test, where individuals struggle to switch to a new sorting rule and keep repeating previously correct responses,
I've heard of that one.
and the difficulties on the Stroop color word test, where the meaning of a word interferes with their ability to name the color of the ink, are classic signs of frontal lobe dysfunction affecting interference control. It's like their brains get stuck on a previous setting and have trouble overriding it.
Those examples really hit home. The Stroop test, in particular, that battle in your mind when the word blue is printed in red ink, and you have to say red, really highlights how automatic some responses are and how much effort it takes to inhibit them.
Exactly. It's a clear demonstration of response competition and the critical role of the frontal lobes in helping you prioritize the task-relevant information, the ink color, over the automatic but irrelevant information,
Right.
the word itself.
Right.
The research also mentions difficulties in other tasks, like paired associate learning, verbal fluency, and the Brown-Peterson task, all of which tap into different aspects of managing interference in memory and language.
And it goes beyond just tests, right? Like behavior changes.
Definitely. Beyond these cognitive tests, there are also reports of behavioral changes, such as increased impulsivity and difficulty adhering to rules, further underscoring the frontal lobe's role in behavioral inhibition.
And to directly link the frontal lobes to these processes, the research points to studies showing increased activity in the frontal cortex during tasks that require selective attention.
Yeah, the brain imaging stuff.
And when people are actively trying to minimize interference in their memory, it's like we can actually see the frontal cortex working harder when we need to filter out distractions.
Yes, those neural imaging studies, often using measures of blood flow, provide direct physiological evidence that the frontal cortex is highly engaged when we're actively resisting interference and trying to maintain focus. It's like the conductor of the brain's orchestra, working to keep all the instruments playing in harmony by dampening any discordant or distracting sounds.
Nice analogy. All right, moving on. The deep dive then takes us into the realm of classical interference theory, pioneered by researchers like Magooch and refined by Melton, Irwin, and Underwood. This approach really focused on how past learning could interfere with new learning, proactive interference, and how new learning could disrupt old learning, retroactive interference.
This was the dominant way of understanding forgetting and memory errors for a significant period in the mid-20th century. Researchers meticulously investigated how factors like the similarity between different sets of learned material.
Like learning Spanish after French.
Exactly, that kind of similarity. And also, the degree to which the initial material was learned. How well you knew it could influence the amount of proactive and retroactive interference observed. It was a very systematic and influential approach to understanding the mechanics of memory.
And it sounds like this theory held sway for quite some time, but then started to lose ground as more cognitively oriented explanations, focusing on the mental processes involved in retrieval and encoding, gained prominence. What shifted the focus?
Well, while classical interference theory provided valuable insights into how associations can compete in memory, it began to feel somewhat limited in its ability to account for the full complexity of human memory.
Not the whole picture.
Right. The rise of cognitive psychology in the latter half of the 20th century brought with it a focus on the active mental processes involved in learning and remembering, such as how we encode information initially and how we retrieve it later. These new perspectives highlighted that forgetting wasn't just about interference between associations, but also about the strategies we use and the way information is organized in our minds.
However, the research also points out that interference concepts are seeing a bit of a resurgence in contemporary psychology, although with some key differences in how they're being approached.
That's true. There's renewed interest.
What are the main distinctions in this renewed interest?
The modern perspective on interference builds upon the classical work, but expands its scope in several important ways. There's a greater emphasis on understanding how interference operates in more complex real-world situations, rather than just in tightly controlled laboratory settings with, word lists.
Like everyday life interference.
Exactly. There's also a much stronger focus on individual and developmental differences in how people experience and manage interference, as well as on studying how these processes might be disrupted in atypical populations, or those with neurological or psychological conditions.
Right.
Finally, there's a move away from a purely associationistic view towards incorporating broader cognitive constructs like attention, working memory, and executive functions in understanding how interference affects performance.
So that brings us to some of these modern theoretical frameworks that are trying to explain interference and inhibition. The research groups them into two main categories: those that emphasize how interference is created and our ability to resist it, and those that focus more on the active process of inhibiting irrelevant information.
While these two categories offer slightly different perspectives, the underlying consensus is that both the ability to resist interference and the capacity for active inhibition are fundamental cognitive processes. They're essential for understanding the full range of human cognitive abilities.
Let's dive into some of these specific frameworks. First up is Dempster's resistance to interference framework. What's the core idea behind this?
Dempster proposes that the ability to resist interference is a fundamental and independent cognitive skill, not simply a byproduct of other cognitive processes.
So it's its own thing.
Pretty much. While acknowledging the involvement of the frontal lobes, his framework suggests that there are different forms of interference motor, perceptual, and verbal, and that our sensitivity to these different types of interference follows distinct developmental trajectories throughout childhood.
And these developmental paths show that our sensitivity to different types of interference changes as we grow, right? Like motor interference being most pronounced early in life,
Yes.
perceptual interference peaking in the preschool years, and verbal interference becoming more significant later on.
Exactly. This framework helps explain why, for example, very young children might struggle with tasks like the A not B object permanence task.
The baby reaching for the old spot.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They might know where the toy is hidden, but they haven't yet developed the ability to inhibit the motor response of reaching to the previous location. Dempster's theory also looks at how our resistance to interference interacts with other cognitive resources, like our overall processing capacity and the strategies we employ, to influence how effectively we learn and use new information.
So it connects to other things.
Yes, it highlights that individual differences in our ability to manage interference can have broad implications for cognitive function.
Next, we have fuzzy trace theory by Brainerd and Reyna. This theory came about, in part, from the somewhat surprising observation that memory and reasoning abilities don't always develop in lockstep.
Right, that's an interesting finding.
What's the central idea here?
Brainerd and Reyna observed that people often rely on different types of memory representations for remembering and reasoning. They proposed that we tend to remember and reason using fuzzy or gist-like
The
representations.
general idea.
Exactly, capturing the general meaning or essence of information, rather than precise, verbatim traces that contain all the specific details.
So when we're reasoning, we might operate on a general understanding like C has more than A, rather than recalling the exact quantities of A, B, and C.
Precisely.
But this fuzzy memory isn't always sufficient, right? Like in mental arithmetic, you really need those exact numbers.
Absolutely. Fuzzy traces are often efficient for intuitive reasoning, but tasks requiring precision, like mental calculations or recalling specific instructions, necessitate access to those more detailed verbatim traces.
Makes sense.
Brainerd and Reyna argue that it's our natural habit of mind to lean towards processing information in terms of these fuzzy gists. Interestingly, they also found that memory for the gist of something can be quite durable, persisting even when the detailed verbatim memory fades.
Oh.
And sometimes the initial processing of the gist can even interfere with our later recall of the verbatim details, particularly in younger children.
Then we have Diamond's frontal lobe model, which really puts the spotlight on the protracted development of the frontal lobes as being crucial for the transition to adult-level cognitive abilities, with inhibition playing a starring role in this developmental process.
Diamond's work has been instrumental in emphasizing the critical role of the frontal lobes, and specifically inhibitory control, in cognitive development. Her research, which combines behavioral studies with insights from animal models, suggests that as the frontal lobes mature, children not only acquire more knowledge, but also develop an enhanced ability to inhibit actions and thoughts that might prevent them from effectively using that knowledge.
So learning and controlling.
Exactly. She describes early cognitive development as a process of gaining control over their behavior, and inhibition is key to that control.
And this model offers a really interesting take on the classic A not B task, suggesting that infants might actually know where the toy is hidden, but simply lack the inhibitory control to override the previously successful motor response of reaching to the old location.
Yes, that's the core idea.
And you mentioned that eye tracking studies seem to support this idea.
Yes. Eye tracking studies have shown that even as an infant's hand reaches for the incorrect location A, their gaze often shifts to the correct location B. This dissociation between what they seem to know and what they do provides compelling evidence that the difficulty lies not in a lack of knowledge about the toy's location, but in the immature frontal lobe's inability to inhibit the previously learned motor response.
Wow, that's fascinating. Moving on, we have the inefficient inhibition model by Bjorklund and Harnischfeger. This builds on the idea of limited mental resources, but specifically highlights how inefficient inhibition can clutter up our working memory with irrelevant information.
This model proposes that our ability to effectively inhibit irrelevant information is crucial for efficient cognitive processing. When inhibition is inefficient, irrelevant details can sneak into our working memory, taking up valuable space and resources.
Like mental junk mail?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Space that could otherwise be used for processing relevant information and carrying out necessary cognitive operations. This idea is similar to Hasher and Zach's model of cognitive aging, which suggests that older adults' cognitive performance may be affected by a decline in inhibitory control, leading to more irrelevant information being active in their working memory.
Ah, so it affects older adults too.
It seems to. Interestingly, Bjorklund and Harnischfeger also discuss potential sex differences in inhibitory abilities, suggesting that females might show advantages in social and behavioral inhibition, while cognitive inhibition differences might be less pronounced.
And finally, McCall's inhibition theory focuses on how early infant abilities like habituation and recognition memory can actually predict later IQ scores,
Which is pretty remarkable.
suggesting a fundamental link between early inhibitory processes and general intelligence.
McCall's research indicates that how quickly an infant becomes habituated to a repeated stimulus, a sign of filtering out the familiar, and their preference for novelty indicating an ability to detect and focus on new information in infancy, are surprisingly good predictors of their IQ later in childhood and adolescence.
Wow.
He even cites studies showing that infants with faster fixation times on visual attention tasks, suggesting an efficient ability to focus and disengage from stimuli, tended to perform better on verbal analogy problems with distracting information and had higher IQ scores at age 12. This really underscores the idea that the early capacity to inhibit irrelevant stimuli is a foundational element of general intelligence.
It's remarkable how these different modern theories, while approaching the issue from slightly different angles, all point to the critical roles of both resisting interference and actively inhibiting irrelevant information in shaping our cognitive abilities and how they develop.
Indeed, they provide a much more nuanced and dynamic understanding of these processes than earlier, more static views. It's clear these aren't just side issues, they're central.
Now, the research takes a really important turn by looking at how these concepts of interference and inhibition manifest in at-risk students. It seems like young children, often described by teachers as distractible, might have a weaker ability to inhibit visual information, making it harder for them to focus on things like text in a busy classroom.
That's a key insight. If a child's visual system is less efficient at filtering out extraneous details, the classroom environment, with its many visual stimuli, can be particularly challenging.
Overwhelming.
Exactly. Their tendency towards perseveration, getting stuck on a particular response or way of thinking, also points to difficulties with inhibition. The example of struggling with missing add-in math problems because they keep trying to apply standard addition strategies highlights this cognitive inflexibility.
Right, they can't switch gears.
And they also might have more difficulty suppressing inappropriate behavioral responses or using verbal self-regulation to guide their actions.
And what about children with reading and learning disabilities? The research suggests they often show greater interference on the Stroop test and make more perseverative errors on the WCST,
Yes, that pattern comes up frequently.
suggesting that these underlying inhibitory deficits might actually contribute to their learning difficulties. There's even a possible connection to lower levels of GABA, that inhibitory neurotransmitter we talked about earlier.
Yes, the evidence strongly suggests that difficulties in inhibiting irrelevant information and controlling responses to competing stimuli play a significant role in reading and learning disabilities. Their poorer performance on tasks specifically designed to measure interference and inhibition aligns with this idea.
And the GABA link?
The potential link to reduced GABA activity provides a possible neurobiological mechanism that could underlie these cognitive deficits. It's still being researched, but it's a promising connection.
It's quite striking how the symptoms often associated with ADHD impulsivity, difficulty focusing, seem to mirror what we see in individuals with frontal lobe damage, again pointing to a core issue with deficient inhibitory control.
The parallels are indeed compelling. Children with ADHD consistently demonstrate difficulties on tasks that require inhibiting prepotent responses or resisting distractions, such as the WCST and the Stroop test.
So it's not just about being hyper.
Not at all. This reinforces the understanding that a core feature of ADHD involves challenges in executive functions, particularly inhibitory control.
What about children with intellectual disabilities? There was an earlier idea of cognitive rigidity, a difficulty in shifting mental gears or inhibiting learned responses. And more recent research seems to support the idea of inefficient inhibition. What does that look like?
Early observations of individuals with intellectual disabilities noted a tendency to get stuck in their thinking. More recent studies using tasks like negative priming, where responding to a previously ignored stimulus is slowed, and variations of the Stroop test.
Those keep coming up.
They do. As well as the concept of cognitive inertia, difficulty suppressing overlearned responses, all suggest that inefficient inhibition is a significant factor. This means they may have more trouble filtering out irrelevant information and suppressing automatic responses, which can impact learning and problem solving, especially when familiar routines or information conflict with new demands.
It's interesting to see how these concepts extend even to children with conduct disorder who show deficits in both controlling their behavior and in cognitive inhibition. Again, drawing comparisons to individuals with frontal lobe damage.
The impulsivity and difficulty in adhering to social norms seen in conduct disorder are often linked to deficits in inhibitory control. Their difficulties on cognitive tasks that require resisting interference further support this connection.
So trouble stopping impulses.
Exactly. The inability to inhibit aggressive impulses, for example, could be a manifestation of these underlying inhibitory deficits.
Even individuals with psychopathic characteristics, with their hallmark traits of impulsivity and a lack of remorse, might have issues with inhibitory control, particularly when it comes to considering the consequences of their actions,
Right.
or inhibiting responses in reward and punishment scenarios.
The impulsive nature and disregard for negative consequences, often seen in individuals with psychopathic traits, align with the idea of impaired inhibitory control. Research using tasks that assess the ability to inhibit responses based on potential rewards or punishments has indeed shown poorer performance in this population,
So they struggle with that balance.
suggesting a difficulty in overriding immediate impulses in favor of longer-term considerations, or even just immediate negative consequences.
And surprisingly, the research even touches on conditions like obsessive-compulsive disorder, where there might be deficits in cognitive inhibition that contribute to the inability to suppress those intrusive thoughts
Yeah, that's another angle.
at a non-conscious level.
The persistent and intrusive thoughts characteristic of OCD may be linked to a difficulty in inhibiting these thoughts at a very fundamental level. This could reflect dysfunction in the neural circuits, including the frontal cortex, that are normally involved in filtering out irrelevant cognitive noise, like a faulty filter. Possibly impaired prepulse inhibition, a measure of how a preceding weak stimulus can inhibit the startle response, has also been observed in individuals with OCD, suggesting a broader issue with sensory and motor gating as well.
Finally, the research discusses individuals with schizophrenic-like symptoms, viewing these on a spectrum. It seems that even people who are psychosis-prone but don't have a full diagnosis show similar challenges on tasks like the Stroop test and negative priming,
Right, indicating potential vulnerability.
indicating a potential weakness in inhibition and a heightened susceptibility to interference.
Yes, this suggests that a reduced capacity for inhibition and an increased vulnerability to interference might be a common underlying factor in the spectrum of psychotic experiences. The fact that individuals exhibiting psychosis-prone traits show similar performance on these cognitive tasks to those diagnosed with schizophrenia hints at a potential shared neural mechanism.
It's quite striking how this lens of interference and inhibition can help us understand such a diverse range of challenges faced by different groups. It really connects a lot of dots.
Absolutely. It provides a valuable framework for thinking about the cognitive underpinnings of various learning and behavioral difficulties.
Mm.
It's not the only factor, of course, but it seems to be a very important one.
Now, let's shift gears and think about what all of this means for educational psychology research. One area that comes up is intelligence. The research points out this apparent paradox where damage to the frontal lobes, which we've established is so important for inhibition,
Right.
often doesn't have a huge impact on standard IQ test scores. How do we reconcile that?
The key to understanding this paradox lies in the distinction between what's often called crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence.
Okay, explain those.
Crystallized intelligence refers to our accumulated knowledge and skills that we've learned over time, often culturally mediated facts, vocabulary, that sort of thing. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, is our ability to reason and solve novel problems, to think flexibly and abstractly.
Ah, problem solving on the fly.
Exactly. While frontal lobe damage might not significantly affect our store of accumulated knowledge, crystallized intelligence, it tends to impact fluid intelligence more directly. Standard IQ tests often include measures that tap into both, but they might not be as sensitive to the specific deficits in executive functions, like inhibition, that result from frontal lobe damage.
So the tests aren't perfect for this.
They might miss certain things. However, subtests that do rely more heavily on novel problem solving, like certain visual spatial reasoning tasks, might be more effective.
And there are some interesting links between intelligence and how we handle interference. For example, the research mentions that people with higher intelligence tend to be less slowed down by irrelevant information in tasks that require quick categorization, and are less easily distracted in visual search tasks.
Yes, that suggests that a greater capacity for resisting interference is a characteristic often associated with higher levels of intelligence. Our own research, mentioned in the sources, showed correlations between measures of resistance to interference and both general intellectual ability and mathematical aptitude, further supporting this connection.
So being able to filter stuff out helps you be smarter, essentially.
It seems to be a component, yes. This also has implications for understanding giftedness. The ability to selectively attend to relevant information and effectively filter out distractions might be a key component of insightful problem solving in gifted individuals. They're better at focusing on the signal and ignoring the noise.
It's also intriguing to consider how these concepts of interference and inhibition might relate to something like social and emotional intelligence, our ability to understand and manage emotions and navigate social situations effectively.
Absolutely. Many aspects of social and emotional intelligence, such as the ability to regulate one's own emotions, inhibit impulsive reactions in social interactions, and delay gratification.
The marshmallow test comes to mind.
Exactly. Those likely rely heavily on underlying inhibitory control mechanisms managed by the frontal lobes. This is an area where further research could yield valuable insights into the cognitive foundations of social and emotional competence.
What about how we learn and use different strategies for solving problems? How do interference and inhibition play a role there?
The phenomenon of utilization deficiency, where children might learn a new strategy but not actually see any improvement in their performance.
That sounds frustrating.
It can be. And it could be related to an inability to inhibit the use of previously learned, less effective strategies or interference from irrelevant information during the strategy execution. They know the new way, but the old way just keeps popping up.
Okay.
Similarly, if a student has trouble maintaining a newly learned strategy over time, it might reflect a failure to inhibit the tendency to revert back to more familiar but less efficient approaches.
Falling back on old habits.
Precisely. Even in something as fundamental as arithmetic, Siegler's research suggests that children's difficulty in inhibiting incorrect but familiar calculation strategies can lead them to rely on less efficient methods. So it seems that inhibitory mechanisms are crucial not only for learning new strategies, but also for effectively implementing and consistently choosing the most appropriate ones.
Reading comprehension is another critical area in education. The research talks about an interference sensitivity account of reading comprehension. What does that mean?
This perspective suggests that our ability to understand what we read is significantly influenced by our capacity to resist various forms of interference.
Like what kind of interference?
Well, it could include interference from irrelevant information within the text itself, ambiguity in word meanings, where a word has multiple meanings and you have to pick the right one for the context,
Right.
or even proactive or retroactive interference from previously read material or prior knowledge that conflicts with the current text.
And this affects kids differently.
We see developmental differences here, with younger children often being more susceptible to distractions and having more difficulty suppressing irrelevant meanings of words. Similarly, individual differences exist, with children who have reading disabilities often showing greater susceptibility to interference on various cognitive tasks and reading more slowly when there are distractions present.
Makes sense.
Conversely, good comprehenders tend to be better at filtering out extraneous information and show less interference on memory tasks. They're better mental jugglers, in a way.
And when we look at logical and mathematical reasoning, it seems that errors are often attributed not just to a lack of logical ability, but also to interference from misleading or irrelevant information.
Yes, very often.
Like those visual cues in Piaget's classic conservation tasks or the inclusion illusion in class inclusion problems.
Exactly. These types of errors often occur because our attention is drawn to salient but irrelevant features of the problem, and we struggle to inhibit those misleading cues in order to focus on the underlying logical structure.
The visuals trick you.
They can. Fuzzy trace theory also provides a perspective here, suggesting that if we're relying on a fuzzy, gist-based representation, we might miss crucial details that are necessary for accurate reasoning, leading to a sort of memory-related interference in the reasoning process.
Finally, in the realm of self-regulated learning, our ability to take control of our own learning, the concept of volition or choice, is central. And the research suggests that inhibition plays a key role in making effective choices. potentially explaining why students sometimes set unrealistic goals or stick with learning strategies that aren't actually working for them.
The ability to make conscious and effective choices about our learning strategies and goals inherently involves inhibiting impulsive decisions or the tendency to stick with familiar but unproductive approaches.
Stopping yourself from doing the easy thing.
Right. Therefore, inhibitory control and the ability to manage internal interference from our own biases or preconceptions are likely critical for successful self-regulated learning.
And when we think about retention of information, how well we remember what we've learned, the research reminds us that interference isn't just a theoretical issue in memory experiments.
Oh, definitely not.
Proactive and retroactive interference definitely impact how well we retain information from our everyday experiences, as we see in things like eyewitness suggestibility. There's also the phenomenon of retrieval inhibition,
Right, retrieval-induced forgetting.
where actively trying to recall some information can actually make it harder to remember related information that you didn't try to recall.
Yes, the principles of interference that were first identified in the lab have clear implications for how we remember real-world events. Retrieval inhibition highlights the competitive nature of memory retrieval. When you focus on retrieving one memory, it can sometimes suppress the retrieval of related memories, even if they're also important.
That's counterintuitive.
It can seem that way. Interference also plays a role in how we understand and remember complex information, like thematically connected discourse. If you read two passages on the same general topic but with different details, the later passage can interfere with your memory of the earlier one, particularly if the information overlaps in some ways but contradicts in others.
So reading related stuff can sometimes mess you up.
It can, depending on the overlap and differences. And this susceptibility to interference can depend on whether we're trying to remember the specific details, verbatim, or just the main ideas.
This has been a truly comprehensive exploration of interference and inhibition, but the research also touches on some critical issues that still need to be addressed in this field. One is the question of necessity. Why haven't these concepts been more central to mainstream cognitive theories?
That's a fair question. One argument has been that many of the phenomena attributed to interference and inhibition could potentially be explained by other mechanisms, particularly those related to activation and excitation in neural networks, sort of like things just get activated too much or incorrectly.
So maybe we don't need inhibition as a concept.
That's the argument some might make. However, there are counterarguments, such as the fact that interference-based explanations of certain memory phenomena, like that retrieval-induced forgetting we just mentioned, seem to provide a better account of the findings than purely activation-based accounts. This suggests that interference and inhibition are indeed distinct and necessary constructs for fully understanding cognition.
Okay. Another challenge is the need for more precise differentiation between the various types of interference: proactive, retroactive, coactive.
Mm-hmm.
And even finer distinctions within these categories, such as interference in different content domains or affecting different stages of processing.
Absolutely. A more nuanced understanding requires us to move beyond broad categories of interference and to identify the specific mechanisms at play in different situations. For example, interference in remembering a list of words might operate differently than interference in trying to solve a spatial reasoning problem.
It's not all the same.
Exactly. We need to develop more refined classifications and theoretical models to capture these distinctions.
And then there's the complex and still somewhat unclear relationship between inhibition and interference effects. Are they fundamentally distinct processes, or are they closely intertwined, maybe two sides of the same coin?
The relationship between inhibition and interference is likely multifaceted. There's evidence to suggest that there might be multiple distinct inhibitory mechanisms in the brain.
Different kinds of stopping power.
Sort of. And how they interact with interfering information might depend on the specific characteristics of that information and the type of inhibition involved. For example, some research has shown that age-related declines in inhibition might affect the processing of the identity of a distractor differently than the processing of its location, suggesting different underlying mechanisms.
Interesting. Finally, there's the really important issue of the construct validity of the tasks we use to measure interference and inhibition. A test that works well for one group might not be valid for another.
This is a critical methodological consideration. We need to ensure that the tasks we use to assess interference sensitivity and inhibitory control are actually measuring what we intend them to measure.
Making sure the tool measures the right thing.
Precisely. And that they're appropriate for the specific populations we are studying. A task like the Stroop test, for instance, might not be a valid measure of inhibition in very young children who haven't yet developed automatic word reading. Their struggle isn't about inhibition, it's about reading skill. Similarly, the Wisconsin card sorting test might have different demands for individuals with different levels of cognitive development or neurological conditions. We need to be cautious about generalizing findings across different tasks and populations, and to strive for more independent and well-validated measures.
These are all really important points, highlighting that while we've learned a great deal about interference and inhibition, there's still a lot of work to be done in refining our understanding and the tools we use to study them.
Absolutely. These are active and ongoing areas of research, and addressing these critical issues will be essential for future progress in the field.
So, bringing this all back to the practical world of education, what are some of the key implications of this research for how we teach and how students learn? It sounds like there are some pretty direct takeaways.
One overarching implication, which is maybe a bit controversial, is the idea that in our efforts to cover vast amounts of material, we might be inadvertently creating unnecessary interference for our students. The sources mentioned the potentially overstuffed curriculum in American schools.
Too much, too fast.
Potentially. The principle of less is more seems particularly relevant here. A more focused curriculum that allows for deeper understanding and integration of concepts might be more effective than one that overwhelms students with a constant barrage of new, potentially interfering information.
And the research also suggests some specific instructional strategies that educators can use to help reduce interference in the classroom, right?
Yes, strategies that help students clearly distinguish between relevant and potentially competing information are crucial. Think diagrams, clear comparisons, highlighting differences.
Making it clear what's what.
Exactly. Techniques that promote the organization and integration of new information with existing knowledge can also reduce interference by creating stronger and more coherent memory representations. Concept maps, outlines, summaries.
Tools for organizing thoughts.
Right. Encouraging students to elaborate on concepts and make connections, asking how and why, relating it to their own experiences, can lead to deeper understanding, which also makes the information more resistant to interference.
Going beyond just memorizing.
Definitely. And finally, explicitly teaching and encouraging selective attention skills can help students focus on what's important and filter out distractions. Even something as simple as encouraging students to actively think about how different pieces of information relate to each other can reduce interference during retrieval.
So helping them connect the dots themselves.
Precisely. The model of effective reading and learning mentioned in the sources, selecting relevant info, organizing it, and integrating it with what you already know, provides a useful framework for thinking about how to minimize interference and promote deeper learning.
This has truly been a deep dive into the fascinating world of interference and inhibition. To recap, we've explored the historical roots of these ideas, delved into modern theoretical frameworks, examined their impact on various cognitive functions and at-risk populations. Considered the implications for educational psychology research across a wide range of domains, touched on some of the key conceptual challenges in the field, and finally discussed the practical relevance of these concepts for educational practice.
And for you, the learner, understanding the fundamental roles of interference and inhibition provides a powerful new lens through which to view the challenges and complexities of learning and memory.
Yeah, explains a lot.
Recognizing that these processes are central to our ability to focus, learn effectively, and navigate a world filled with information offers valuable insights into your own cognitive experiences and individual differences. The crucial role of the frontal cortex in managing distractions and the various forms that interference can take highlight the remarkable adaptability and sometimes frustrating limitations of our cognitive systems.
We're not perfect machines.
Far from it. The practical strategies we've discussed, such as creating less cluttered learning environments and employing techniques that promote deeper understanding and selective attention, offer tangible ways to combat interference and enhance your own learning journey.
So, here's a final provocative thought for you to consider. Given the profound and far-reaching impact of interference and inhibition across so many facets of our cognition and behavior, what might be the transformative potential of a more intentional and systematic approach to developing these mental muscles through targeted activities and curriculum design?
Actively training inhibition.
Maybe. What if we were to fundamentally shift our educational priorities to focus not just on the sheer volume of information presented, but with equal emphasis on how effectively students can process, filter, and retain that information amidst the ever-increasing noise of the modern world? It's a question that I think has the potential to reshape the very landscape of learning and education.
Indeed. It can lead to a more focused, effective, and ultimately more rewarding learning experience for everyone. A very interesting thought to end on.